Absolutely. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Bridget Hassig, and I'm on the board of Great Lakes Urban. As you may know, Great Lakes Urban connects people in community and strengthens their efforts to build strong, safe, connected, and healthy neighborhoods, communities, and cities. Our quarterly Lunch and Learn is always a way to spread best practices in neighborhood flourishing and development. And we like to interview practitioners and thought leaders in the asset-based community development movement, also known as ABCD. And with that, I would like to introduce Eric Smith, our moderator for today's webinar. Eric joined Great Lakes Urban in 2020, fortunately, as our executive director. He's been building more connecting communities through the years in Uganda, Appalachia, and beyond, and been doing that for more than 2 decades. Thank you, Eric.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bridget. I really appreciate that. And folks, I did see a comment that we're having issue with the chat. We're working on that currently. We'll get that resolved. In the meantime, I just want to say how excited we are to have you here today. I'm particularly excited because I hold in such high regard the work of the Neighboring Movement, which is our feature organization for this quarter's spotlight or bright spot in asset-based community development. So welcome everyone. A couple of logistics before we get started. First of all, we want this to feel like a discussion. And in order to make that feel like that, I would recommend if you go up to the top right of your screen, you'll see a little icon that says view. And if you click on that, you have different options. And you may already be on this, but if you can, go to gallery, the gallery view option, and that way you can see all of us on your screen at the one time. That makes it feel like a discussion. Some of you have sent over some questions to us, but others may have some questions pop up over the course of our moderated discussion. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see something that says Q&A. And so you're welcome to drop questions in that Q&A section as we go along in that box, and then we'll address those once we get to the last third or so of this conversation. We'll open up our time together for those questions. The last thing I want to say is you've already heard us mention ABCD, which is short for asset-based community development. And so since you'll hear that a lot, I just wanted to make note of what that is. It's a ground-up approach to community building and community development. And it's really a relationally driven approach. It's an inside out, it's community led, it's asset or strengths or gifts based. It's also place centered approach to community work. And so that's what we mean by ABCD as we move forward. So with that, like I say, I'm excited to have our panelists here joining with us. And I'd like for us to go around the screen. Maybe Adam, will start with you. But would you just start us off by sharing a little bit about yourself and your role with the Neighboring Movement?
I'd be happy to. So hello all, my name is Adam Barlow Thompson. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm in Wichita, Kansas, in the founding neighborhood of the Neighboring Movement, which is the Sosi neighborhood here in Wichita. It's just south of our downtown. And yeah, I am one of the co-founders of the Neighboring Movement and am the executive director here. And so I'm grateful to be with y'all. So I'll pass it to Catherine next, I think.
Sure, yeah. So my name is Catherine Johnson. My pronouns are she, her. I'm also one of the co-founders of the Neighboring Movement and live in our founding neighborhood. And I was just adding it up. I think I've lived here for like 14 years or something. So it's been a while, and I enjoy just working as a connector in our neighborhood. So Elizabeth?
Yes, I'm Elizabeth, pronouns she, her, and I'm the program director for our Community Animator Network program, which started in 2020. Correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, but I think that's technically when we did the first cohort.
It was a pandemic, baby.
Oh, wow. Yes. All right. So maybe, Adam, if we could come back to you, and if you could start us off with sort of telling us about the Neighboring Movement. What do we need to know about the organization and your work there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the neighboring movement started in 2015. My wife, Ashley, and Catherine and her husband, Matt, started meeting. We are across the street neighbors, and we wanted to be good neighbors where we live. We come out of a Christian faith tradition that informed some of our work, but we're not necessarily all Christian or all secular. We kind of do a mix of things, the neighboring movement, based on our program area. And we just wanted to be good neighbors where we live on our block. What we discovered is that the people on our block actually were already pretty amazing. And we did not have the language of asset-based community development at that point, but quickly found that and adopted it as our method, and have been practicing that. And then our founding neighborhood since 2015 with intention, and then had people reaching out to us through our connections, especially in the faith-based world, and saying, hey, will you teach us about what you're discovering in your neighborhoods? And so we put together some workshops and some curriculum originally just for churches to share some of what we'd learned in the neighborhood and how asset-based community development was impacting us as people in our neighborhood. And that grew into a national network of churches that go through a curriculum we call the Good Neighbor Experiment. And then, as Elizabeth mentioned, in 2020, we had because of the shifting sands of the pandemic, we had an opportunity to take advantage of a grant to create what I would call like an organizer training program. And we train individuals who then in asset-based community development, and then they do local projects wherever they are. We've had about 60 people go through that now and do some amazing projects with just simply doing listening conversations to people's giftedness wherever they are, connecting those gifts, and then mobilizing them through the action that is led by the people who live in those communities. And so the neighboring movement now has kind of three fronts. We work in the neighborhood where we live, the Soci neighborhood here in Wichita. We work in our faith-based network, which is across the whole country. And we work in the Animator Network, which primarily is in the state of Kansas, with a few folks who join us from other places as well. And all of our work is centered around asset-based community development. And our nuance to that, the way that we've articulated it, is that we have these key ingredients of neighboring that we call joy, relationship, and abundance. And all of our curriculum teaches ABCD with these key ingredients of joy, relationship, and abundance as the primary way that we talk about being a good neighbor and being an organizer in your community.
Wow. I hope people are getting a sense of just the breadth of the work and the impact. And so love that. Thank you, Adam. So Catherine, we're going to kind of follow that journey, that path that Adam shared for us, that the bones of the infrastructure, and move from sort of like the local to Kansas to national. And so I'd like for you to speak into, you said you're the connector for the Soci neighborhood, the South Central neighborhood there in Wichita. Could you unpack that for us? What's the context? What's the narrative, the story, the arc, the journey that the neighborhood is on and that you're part of and that you're helping to catalyze?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So our neighborhood is located just south of downtown. And so I think sometimes it's kind of an overlooked or forgotten place. Like once you stop downtown, then whatever comes after that is just sort of a gray area. But it's cut through the middle by kind of a main road that's called Broadway. And it kind of divides the neighborhood in half because it has a lot of used car lots and things like hourly motels, and is kind of known for negative stories like drug activity. And those are the things that make the news, but that's not the full story of our neighborhood. And so there's about 11,000 people in the neighborhood as defined by the city of Wichita, which is really big and hard to manage. That's a lot of people to get to know. So our work over the last couple of years has really focused on just the north quarter of the neighborhood, and like that seems a bit more manageable for now. And so we're just trying to really get to know the people in those like 550 households approximately, and just starting to build relationships there and encourage them to get to know each other. And so I think going back to the story of how we began that Adam referenced, like when my husband and I moved into the neighborhood in 2008, it was summer. And so we just sat in the shade in our front yard and kind of observed what was happening on our block. And we noticed a person that people had told us had some physical disabilities and couldn't work outside her home. We noticed that she would walk her dog every day and roll up the trash cans when it was different people's trash day on the block. And there was a guy, I think in his 70s or 80s, who we noticed was taking care of the woman at the end of the block who was 10 years older than that. And he loved to make food and he would like take her newspaper up. And so we were just observing this network of care that existed on our block long before we got there. And so that is really what opened our eyes to ABCD. And we wanted something that honored all of those gifts that we were seeing in the neighborhood. And so, yeah, that's how it started. And then recently we've done different things like knocking on all of those 550 doors and saying, what do you love to do? What are you good at? What do you care about? And surprisingly, some people share with us amazing stories of the things that they love to do and the gifts that they have. And then a couple of weeks ago, we tried just hosting like an indoor block party and inviting all of those people to come. We had 2 time options. I think thankfully not all 500 of them came. And so they were small enough gatherings that we could get to know people. And again, we just keep asking, what do you love to do? What do you know well enough that you could teach somebody else to do? And it doesn't have to be something that has monetary value or that could be a career. It's just things that people care about. And so, yeah, we have people who make beautiful art. We have people who love gardening. People who can fix anything, people who can do demolition. And so then now our work is how do you connect those and help those people work together to like make the dreams come true for our neighborhood.
That's great. Thank you, Catherine. And
yeah,
I love how you unpack that. It feels like you're saying ABCD is first and foremost, it's changing our lens, how we view the world, right, to a gift-centered lens of, hey, you know, here's somebody in the neighborhood has been given a label. We're going to see them as gifted, and they walk the dog every day, and you know, we recognize those kinds of things. And then the second piece is that there's some, you know, tools and methodology you can dip into, such as going and knocking on doors and asking those more powerful questions that we don't often ask each other. And then from that, you're discovering gifts and assets and talents, and then making those connections. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
So just kind of keep going on this journey, you know, like zooming out. I feel like with Neighbor Movement, we just keep having to zoom out, right? So it's a very layered organization. And so we'll turn it out to Elizabeth for a little bit. Let me make a quick comment to folks. We're having some issue with the chat feature if you're just joining us. No worries. The Q&A function is working splendidly. You're welcome to drop things in the Q&A that you want, you know, posted in the chat. We can do that for you. And of course, the Q&A box is where you're going to be submitting your questions anyway. So we'll turn to those questions after this short moderated piece. Okay, Elizabeth. So, you know, animator network. That's what I heard. How it was referred to. I'd love for you to unpack for us what the work of the animator is. For those of you that have been around with Great Lakes Urban for a while, it'll be comparable to what we call connector. But tell us about the animators, what their work is, how you equip, train, mobilize. Yeah, if you could share about the network.
Yeah, so the program is kind of like a community organizing program through the lens of asset-based community development. And it's done in 2 phases, which is how we equip people to engage in these community projects that they themselves create based on their passions in their communities. So we have people participate in the program, which we refer to as animators, because it's kind of like they're animating, they're bringing to life what has often gone invisible in their area, and mobilizing the things that they're seeing. And so they go through, they do it in small cohorts, and we do that intentionally because we want to nurture relationships and really like make it very human-centered experience. Because that's what we've seen works when we do ABCD. It has to start small and very much building relationship, building trust. And so we've done cohorts, about 10 people each, and they go through like an 8-week experience of learning asset-based community development, and also like practicing those foundational skills at a smaller scale where they live, so they can kind of start to grow those muscles, because it is a shift from our often needs-based lens, which we're not saying is wrong, but it is a very intentional flip. So learning how to practice those and activate at a small scale. And then those animators who complete phase 1 can choose to go into phase 2, which is diving deeper and creating and working on a community project using those ABCD values. And so we have, like Adam said, we have 60 animators. 50 of those are alumni. The other 10 are currently in phase 1, but they are all over Kansas, and they pop in and out of the program itself. So while they may be alumni, they might come back and join phase 2 at a different time, or we also do voter outreach that is very purely relational. That follows ABCD, but as far as like things that phase 2 people are doing right now, we have animators who created a support group in Wichita, Kansas, for Hispanic first-gen students to help bridge the gap and help first-generation students get into higher education, which we know it's by feeling and having a sense of community and exchanging knowledge and that mentorship. And so it's for high school and college students. And they exchange their gifts whenever they meet twice a month. And then we also have another animator who is in rural liberal Kansas. And she created with her group the Liberal Diversity Council. She noticed that although it was a rural area, there was a lot of diversity that existed there, and but they were siloed. And so she found a way to kind of celebrate the diversity. And it was a group, and they just had their first cultural festival with their group in October. We also have, we have quite a bit of range of projects, but you can see they're very personalized based on what brings joy to them. We have a few others too, but I'll pause there.
Yeah, with 60 engaged folks, that the change is happening, and that's amazing. I do want to know, we've had some chatter going on, and so just I want to say thank you. Got folks piping in from Wisconsin and Kansas, Ontario, London, Ontario, Canada, and elsewhere. So just thank you so much, and let's keep that going. Let's see. I also want to mention here, it looks like Becky's on, and she's in the G&E right now. So Adam, this is a perfect time, I think, to come to you. And you mentioned that there's work that you do with congregations across the country. And so I think if you don't mind sharing a little bit about what you do there, how you equip congregations, but then I imagine that's giving you some insight into how do organizations, how do they be good neighbors as well, right? As a corporate entity, collective of people, how does an organization catalyze and inspire good neighboring as well?
Yeah, sure. And let me just caveat, I've frozen a couple times already. So if I freeze up, then someone else can take the answer. They'll be smarter than me anyway. So yeah, we work in churches with through a program called the Good Neighbor Experiment, and it has kind of two parts that we're trying to deliver for churches. One is a cultural change, and that's a cultural change from delivering programs to really centering on relationships, from inauthenticity to joy. A lot of times churches get pulled into trying to look like other people or other institutions. And so how do we focus on joy and being just who you are in your community? And then focus a change in culture from scarcity to abundance. And so you hear those three key ingredients I shared earlier of relationship, abundance, and joy kind of at the center of that. That's my mail just got delivered. And so yeah, and so there's a cultural shift, and then there's a bunch of neighboring tools. And a lot of what we do at the neighboring movement is we beg, borrow, and steal from other ABCD practitioners. And then we created a bunch of our own unique tools that we share for how to actually do the work of meeting neighbors, organizing them, connecting them, mobilizing those gifts. And so we share those tools as part of that process as well. I think kind of like in a simplest way, why I think it's so important for churches. So I'm a former local pastor in the United Methodist systems, and I was trained to, as a pastor, create programs and try to bring people to my church building to do the program. And so like one of the things we do in our work is we do what, a lot of, I think, ABCD people do, is we gather folks and we say, what do you love? What do you love to do? And a group of church people will gather, and they will learn new things about each other that they didn't know. And so, maybe people who usually go to Sunday school, and then all of a sudden they realize that 3 of the people who've been going to Sunday school together for a really long time all really love knitting, but they didn't realize that they all love knitting because they'd only really met each other in this one particular context. Well, the way that most churches respond to that is they say, oh my God, we have 3 people who love knitting. We should start a knitting club at our church. And that's like natural tendency. That's what I would do as a pastor. That's how I was trained. But what we're saying is, wait, don't start a program at your church. My guess is that in every committee or every community, there is somewhere where a knitting club already exists. And what we want to do as a church, and for other institutions that offer care as well, we want to go and discover in our community where these things are already happening and participate in that in those activities with the community leading them. And as someone who hosts a lot of things that I just am like begging and hoping, and like, that moment where you host an event and you're like, God, I just hope somebody shows up. If you're in this call, my guess is you've experienced that, where you've hosted an event and just said, oh my God, I just hope somebody shows up. How cool is it when 3 people walk in and say, hey, we're all coming to your thing to support you in what you're doing? It feels awesome. It feels like, man, this is a huge success. And then what people generally do is they say, oh my gosh, thank you for coming. How did you hear about it? And if those people say, well, our church is doing this thing where we're trying to engage in the community instead of just forcing the community to engage with us, we're going to meet you where you are. And so those are the kind of things that the Good Neighbor Experiment does through a series of a worship series, small group material, and really experimental practices where we get to know our communities and work within them.
Yeah, that's amazing, right? So yeah, I love that concept. How do we be with the community? Just to dig in a different lens, a different perspective, a different approach than what is typical in an organization or even a congregation. So now that we've kind of laid the groundwork, we know the diversity of work that's happening at the neighboring movement. This is where my favorite question comes in. I would love to know, maybe we could just follow the same pattern, Catherine, Elizabeth, Adam, from the work, from your context, what's your favorite story?
I think one of my favorite stories that is coming to mind, and the theme of it, the takeaway for me is that in neighboring and in ABCD, that small things or things that may even seem inconsequential actually matter and have power and significance. And so that was shown to me. It was probably like August of 2021. We were able to connect a neighbor who had a vehicle but didn't have a driver's license with another neighbor who has a career in driving but didn't have a vehicle. And so those seem like simple things. Those might not even come up in a conversation, but we happened to be in conversation with both of those people. And the person with the vehicle said, I really need to buy a lawnmower. My lawn looks terrible, but I can't drive anywhere to get it. So do you know of a lawnmower close by? And we said, well, we don't, but we know of a person who'd be happy to drive you. And so that was I think August. And then the person who is the driver, I'll call him Mike, his birthday is in November. And so he had told us, happened to mention last November that the other guy, Bill, had texted him happy birthday on his, and so like, that's just a little thing, but that makes you love your neighborhood and that makes you feel cared for. And it's just that a loose connection there. And so I can see they've continued to just work on things together. They run errands together. Mike told me last week that Bill had been out of town and had called him and said, can you just go by my house and like tuck my mail inside the front door? And so just that little bit of security. These are two older guys that live alone, and it's a tiny connection, but this is over a year later and it's still making a difference. And so, yeah, that just illustrates to me the importance of those small ties, small connections, and talents and gifts that might get overlooked, but are actually really important.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you, Catherine. It's that idea of, we talk a lot of times at Great Lakes Urban, but a more connected neighborhood is a stronger neighborhood, right? It's a safer neighborhood. It's a healthier neighborhood. And there's research around all of that. Youth succeed more in connected neighborhoods, and tons of research around that. But I love that story and how connection made a difference in two people's lives in all those ways, and it really.
Yeah.
And so it's just amazing. And people can imagine, right? That's one small story, but all that's happening, all that churn is happening in the neighborhood. And it adds up to significant impact. Elizabeth, maybe we could go to you. What's a favorite story?
Well, I have a lot, but I'll share a more recent one. But obviously this work is very exciting and there's a lot of good things that come out as far as stories to share. One of the more recent was going to Clarissa's festival that her and her group had been working on for a year. And this just started by a community member who knew friends who were also as passionate as her about like connecting the community where they lived, because they saw that there was a lot of culture and stories that existed, and they came together and put a plan to strive to make a cultural festival happen in Liberal, Kansas, which is a rural space 4 hours away from Wichita, Kansas. And they would meet on a regular basis, and it was just interesting to listen to Clarissa share whenever her group would meet, because it was nothing formal. It wasn't nothing ever like very structured, or it didn't involve going to leaders or with people with titles in the community. It was just her and her neighbors meeting at a local restaurant, or going for margaritas one evening on a Friday to talk about like what's happening, where do they see, like what do they envision together for the project going, who do they know that has parts of the puzzle for their vision, and what relationships do they still need to nurture. And so her group grew too as time went on, and she had a pretty large support group that would meet regularly of about, 8 or so people. And they kind of found, so as they followed the energy and everything, they found that there was a grant where they didn't need to be a nonprofit. It was open. It was like a community project type of thing. And they were very intentional about how they came together to apply for this grant, because they were intentional with using the skills that were existing within the group to pull off writing this grant together. And then they got the grant. So there they had extra funding that they could use for extra expenses that would come up, and then they needed a community space, and there was a community building, and they got together as a group and presented at the county commissioners this idea that they had come together, and it was so cool because the county then supported that vision. It wasn't the county telling the community what to do. It was more of like, we're listening to you and we love this idea, and you can use this huge community space for free for your event planning and to launch your festival. And so they had the event, and then they needed performers, and they like tapped into this asset map where it's basically like the people who are passionate in what they're doing. So they had dancers, they had people who are really good at crafts, they had people who are really good cooks. And they came together in this building space and set up booths. And it was a huge turnout. I drove 4 hours because I really wanted to see this event happen on the day. And it was insane because, kind of like what Adam was saying, I was also like, the animator was also nervous. She's like, what if no one shows up? And I'm like, it's okay. Like, if your team is there, that is a win. And then I was also like, yeah, what if no one shows up? And then I show up and the parking lot is full. And you walk in and it's just so alive in there, quite literally, like the music, the whole sound system, which was all because they knew someone who was a radio and they were gifted in that sort of sound system and they wanted to be there present. And it all honestly took very little money. The grant that they received wasn't something huge either, but they were able to pull off something huge. So that's one of the more recent stories that was really awesome to see, and gave me so much energy. And like, it's just great to see that this does work.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's giving me energy just hearing it secondhand. I love it. And it brings to mind too, right? So a lot of times I'll talk about, hey, we're cultivating connection and change, right? There's belonging and there's agency that's built through this work. And so agencies that sense so that I have the power to shape the world around me. And when we think about, increased polarization and all the things we're experiencing in society, it's the ground game of being able to people to see that they have the power to change the world around them that helps to bring connection and healing. And so I'm hearing people working together for a project, and I just think agency, right? So I love that. Adam, maybe you could share maybe a favorite story from your perspective. Yeah.
I'll share a story from our faith-based side. And so one of our churches in Kansas City, Kansas, when they entered into our kind of world, had a food pantry. And it was a place that was described to me by the pastor who was there as a place that was really focused on scarcity. And they had this long hallway in an old church building in a Spanish-speaking neighborhood where you'd have to walk down this very dark hallway. It had pews on either side of the hallway where neighbors would sit and wait their turn. So you'd have to walk past all your neighbors, and it was like this kind of dark hallway of shame to then go get your box of food from volunteers who didn't speak the language that you spoke. And then you'd get the food and it didn't have the food that you wanted. And so they were having this thing happen where before people would even leave the property, they'd throw away a good portion of the food in the box because it wasn't culturally appropriate. It wasn't something they knew how to cook or that they wanted. And so they quickly realized that this was a scarcity focused program that their church was offering. They didn't want to just close the food pantry down, so they started dreaming and brainstorming about what would it be like for this to be an asset abundance focused type place. And they first started by saying, well, one of the things we know we need to do is we need to have at least 51% of the leadership of the food pantry has to be people who are receiving food from it. And so they first said the people who receive food here, just because they're receiving food doesn't mean they don't have something to offer. So let's put them in charge of the experience. And immediately lots of changes started flowing from that, including always having a Spanish speaker who was there as a volunteer, changing it from a box of food to a grocery store style where you could walk in and pick the things that you wanted. And that hallway, they redid all the lighting and they painted the walls, and they put up these awesome posters where they had a picture of a neighbor and highlighted some things that neighbor offered the neighborhood, some gifts that neighbor brings into the neighborhood. And then one of my favorite things that they've done is they did a recipe of the week where a neighbor would offer a recipe and would say, this is my family's recipe, or here's where it came from, and they would have to go out of their way to make sure all the ingredients for that recipe were available. Sometimes that meant going outside of the kind of traditional sources of food, like the Kansas Food Bank is where they get most of their food, right? And they find ways to do that. And then they'd put the little card in there that said, this recipe comes from your neighbor, and here's who they are, and here's something about them, connecting people to that neighborhood. And it became this place of abundance, so much so that the pastor was telling me that one of the kids that went to their after school program said, the kids were helping stock the shelves at the food pantry because they are part of it now. They're doing the work. And one of the kids said, this is really fun. Can I bring my family to the food pantry? And before, where this place of shame was like, oh gosh, I have to go to the food pantry. Now there are kids saying, this is so much fun. Can I bring people to it? I love this place, because it was community owned, community centered. And the community said, when you went there, it was not because, oh, I'm a needy person. It's because I get to contribute with my community to this space. And so she brought her dad the next week and ran up to the food pantry and showed him all these cool things that she felt like she was owning and contributing to. And I just think that's a beautiful way. We often run into, people who maybe already have some needs-based things going where the energy feels completely drained, and they're like, we can't stop, but we also don't like it anymore. And we know that it's not serving the community in the way we want it to. What do we do? And so how do we brainstorm around these kind of ideas to transform these things into community-owned spaces that are really led by people who are contributing and receiving from them all at the same time? That's our definition for relationship, is the giving and receiving of care. And so that's what happened in that space as well.
That's amazing. Thank you for that, Adam. Yeah, something for us, all of us to think, all right, how do we build that culture of giving, receiving care? Really an idea that would change the world, right?
That's the plan now.
So I wonder, Adam, if we could stay with you for just a second. And I do want to know we do have a lot of questions, and so we want to get to those quickly. We will soon, folks. But Adam, if you could share, I mean, it's to fund the giving and receiving of care. I mean, it's just not baked into how our funding systems work, right? They're looking for program numbers and that sort of thing. And so somehow you've managed in all this. I mean, I think the animators get, some support for their work, and, certainly the staff it takes to support churches and develop those kinds of stories. It takes money. And I just wonder if you'd care to share a little bit about, what have you found? What works?
Yeah. Wing and a prayer, Eric, so we fund from multiple spaces. We're grant funded. We do traditional fundraising, and we also do fee for service type work with folks. We do try to make the way we use money equitable if we can, which is why we pay the animators. A lot of our animators are coming from neighborhoods where there is traditionally under-resourced places. And so we want to say, no, we're going to intentionally put money into those spaces and into the hands of the neighbors who live there. So I think that right now, in what we have found, we've gotten really lucky with grants. And part of what we found is that I think grantors are waking up to some of the roadblocks and barriers of the traditional things that they've been funding. And they're starting to say, we've been funding the same way for a long time, and we're just the old metrics aren't as exciting to us anymore. So when the food pantry comes back and says, we have even more people who are hungry, we have even more people who are unhoused, that doesn't feel very good anymore. And people are starting to wrestle with that. So an alternative narrative has become, I think, enticing for those type of funders, grantor type funders, I mean. Some of our funders are more national, some of them are very local. We try to just keep an eye out for all of those and build relationships with those organizations. I wish there was like an easy silver bullet kind of answer to that, but it's really not. Like, I think similar things that people say all the time, look for organizations that you have a sense want that kind of nuanced answer to things, because we still, 7 years in, when people ask for metrics, we all start sweating, because we're like, we are like, sometimes I tell them our version of metrics and they're like, that's not a metric, that's an output. And I'm like, well, I don't know what to tell you. Do you have time for me to tell you 60 stories? Because that's what I have. That's what I have. And so, but then in the fundraising space, I think that it's similar. Like, we've found again and again funders who are really excited about this. And some of the things that you mentioned, Eric, like there is a body of research building around like what a connected community really offers and how it does impact health outcomes and social determinants of health and all of those kind of things. So it's always a constant battle. You know, it's one of those things that I didn't necessarily plan to be a part of my life, the fundraising and making sure there was enough money, but have, I think, been able to do well because I am just genuinely so excited about the work and like the stories that like Catherine and Elizabeth are sharing. Like, it's hard not to tell that story because it's so exciting. And if I can tell that to people who have resources, usually they're like, yeah, like I'd be willing to chip in and figure out what else we could do with it. The other thing that's really helpful is that, and Elizabeth kind of hinted at this, it doesn't actually take that much money. Like, you know what I mean? Like, most of the stories we told you didn't really take very much money. And so it wasn't that hard to do. So yeah, I would say, so I just was looking at some of the questions that came up. I would say about 60% of our resources are grant funded. And then we have probably 30% or 35, 30, 40, maybe 35% are traditional fundraising, and then a very smaller percentage is like speaking fees. We do have churches pay to be a part of the cohorts that they're in, stuff like that. So
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I want to make sure we have time to get to questions, maybe just a lightning round, 30 seconds a piece. I don't know, just share with us what's bringing you hope right now, and how can people kind of invest time, talent, treasure to build that hope, that give and take of care. Catherine, let's just do our pattern here. We've developed.
Okay.
Elizabeth. Adam.
I'm excited because we have 3 neighbors who are participating in the Community Animator Network program with Elizabeth right now. And so that's my hope for 2023 is what will they do in our neighborhood? And I can see the things that they're interested in, like fixing up a park, working at our neighborhood garden, working on housing concerns. And so, yeah, my hope is just to see what can they do with these skills and a network around them.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Yeah, so something I'm excited for, hopeful for in 2023 is our large animator network is starting to kind of form these little groups to start to like brainstorm ways to keep connected across Kansas, and also brainstorm ways of like how can they make gathering spaces with the animators, and they're leading those efforts. So I'm just excited to see what happens from that.
Yeah, exciting.
Yeah, I think we are we're at an interesting place as an organization where we kind of hit this new plateau and we're trying to figure out what scale looks like. Scale is like a scary word for relational based people. We're like, oh God, how do we scale these intimate relationships? And so I'm very like, I'm excited because our organization's in a place where we have awesome staff people who can do a lot of the work, and I can kind of I'm shifting my role a little bit to think about that a little bit more, and what does it look like to be an organization that can scale and share our things out in different ways. So I'm excited about that space to be in, and places like this where there's like more folks who are just excited to try to experiment in their own communities.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. And I know everybody listening in and those that will watch later, I know they know why we wanted to feature you as a bright spot in ABCD. Such great stories. I do want to note, folks, as we move to our questions, and again, you can use that Q&A box in the bottom there. If we don't get to all the questions, we'll try to, find different ways to do that through our social media posts or etc. And newsletters and such. So do try and stay connected, and we'll help to keep you connected into the growing ABCD movement. If you heard this and you were inspired, like, boy, I do want to get involved in supporting the work and building this neighboring movement along with the neighboring movement. I'm going to throw in the chat just some ideas or some links. So you'll have there, if you want to fund and keep the Stay Animator work growing in Kansas and Wichita and beyond, there's a place to donate to the neighboring movement. We're also at Great Lakes Urban looking at building a pot of money to use for community grants for neighborhoods. You're welcome to donate to us with the end of year contribution. If you want to more invest time in your local context, we've got some ideas at Great Lakes Urban on our Good Neighbor tab, things you might be able to do. Of course, use Neighboring Movement as a resource on that as well. They'll send you stuff every week, ideas of how to be a good neighbor. And then, like I say, stay connected. There's also a link where you can sign up for a newsletter, and you can stay connected, learn about more of these kinds of opportunities and learning opportunities in this work. So those links are all dropped in the chat now. And with that, we'll turn to some questions. And again, panelists, please, if there's one that you don't feel comfortable answering, there's no pressure here. All right.
Pass.
Well, we'll just start from the top here. It says, I love how you start with 550 households. Do you have a sense of how long it will take to expand to an additional sector?
I think that's a challenge because it seems like we can continue to just deepen those relationships in the area where we are. But that's something I'm thankful for and looking forward to with our 3 new animators, because each of them is just an increment south of us in the neighborhood. And so my hope is that they're already, as part of their homework for being an animator, they're getting to know their neighbors. And so I think we'll have just these like small nuclei that develop through the neighborhood. And I think that's how it will spread.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Don't need to, but
I would just add, like, it's always the case that like we're not gonna do it unless there's somebody in those neighborhoods who want to do it, right? So like part of it is like we can't come and do it for them. That's the whole thing, kind of. So we're waiting for them to, and we're just trying to discover them, but also until we find somebody who wants that for their neighborhood, we won't probably go there.
Great. And then Jay asked about evidence of action teams forming, and I think Elizabeth, you shared a story of that, right? So there's people, when it's not just individuals connect with individuals, but when they come together for a project, getting more things done together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, yeah, we have our animators who are doing the projects, but then part of their projects is to find those people that are also sharing that same passion, because that's how we learn that it's more sustainable in that way, because people are going to be there because they love it, and they believe in whatever idea or vision their aim is, and so they typically build a team of about 3 to 4, sometimes larger, but at least about 3 or 4 other people in where they live that can also help brainstorm and collaborate and support.
Wonderful. Let's see, and then we have a question from Miguel asking, how does the neighboring movement interface or interact with the city government, like planning and public health?
Yeah, we've done, it's interesting, like it's another place we don't intentionally, or we didn't intentionally try to intersect with, but there is a lot of power in relationships. And it didn't take long before the city officials in our area realized, like, oh, hey, here's a group of people who have actual relationships with the residents who live in this neighborhood. And they started coming to us and saying, hey, like, who are these people? What do we do? How do we learn from them? Our role now probably is we are a bridge between, I would say, the residents and like city officials. And our primary role is to stand there and say, wait, go talk to the residents before you do that. Because there is a constant battle for people who are in those positions to come up with solutions that are not neighbor-centered. And so we don't have necessarily a lot of interest in like policy advocacy and stuff like that. It's just not been part of our structure so far, but we do try to maintain the relationships with the people we know in the city so that we can continually say, stop, before you create that neighborhood plan that you haven't really listened to the neighbors about what you're planning. Let's engage the neighbors a little bit more before we do that. Or before you plan a big neighborhood cleanup that you haven't actually asked any neighbors to participate in, is there people in the neighborhood already cleaning things that maybe would be more apt to be a part of that? Not that those are based on real stories or anything, but yeah, they are.
Yeah, I will say we'll come back in a second to, there's a few questions really kind of related to resources and what does the neighboring movement have available, whether it's the training for the animators or working with the congregation. So we'll get to that in a second, but we have a question here from R. Hardy asking Catherine, can you say more about how the homeless, the food insecure, those struggling with addiction, and addiction members and members of the community, or how they're mixing with other members of the community, or any recommendation of how or learning points about that kind of demographic?
I mean, I think for us, the most important thing that we've experienced is just seeing all of those folks as gifted, even though they might have those other labels as being unhoused or struggling with addiction or in recovery, whatever it might be. But first asking the same things. What do you love to do? What are you good at? And so our experience has been that sometimes people have forgotten who they are, like they've lost the authenticity and that joy, and they see themselves through a lens of scarcity. And so when we can ask those questions, like I once did that with a person who was really struggling with addiction, and I had people in the room list, what are some things you would like to learn from neighbors? And then I'll see if there's somebody who could teach us those. And at the end, this woman looked at the list and she said, I know how to do almost all of those things, and I didn't know that any of them mattered. And I forgot that I knew how to do those things, outside of my addiction. And so there's a real humanizing element to having the asset lens. And in the end, we invited her to teach a 12-step class to a group of college students that were visiting the neighborhood. And so, yeah, that's the thing that we've learned most, is continuing to ask those questions and letting everyone, whether they are housed at the moment or not, whether they're struggling with something, letting them have ways to share those gifts is good for the neighborhood and the community, and it's healing for them also.
Yeah, so powerful. Thank you, Catherine. Let's see, we're clearly not going to get to all the questions. Dorothy asks, so it sounds like Dorothy's in a context, she has a neighborhood association that like to engage developers, elected officials, and have conversations about needs of existing residents. And this is in the context of a neighborhood that's, is developing. So any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think one of the best pieces of advice that we got with folks like that is to show them instead of tell them. And so it's sometimes hard to convince people who have a mindset of traditional development that what we're doing has the impact that they're looking for. And if you sit down with them across a table and just try to talk them into it, it may not work. But what is way more powerful is to show them by bringing them to the things that you're already doing or the spaces where your community is gathering, and just let them observe that. And then I think people get on board with it quicker, because there is something very palpable about that moment where it shifts from scarcity to abundance. And a lot of developers come in with the mindset of scarcity, and with, I would say, even potentially more harmful version of that, of how can I make money off of this scarcity? And if we can bring them into the space where they say, oh, wait, there's abundance here already, then I think that can be really powerful. I'm not going to say it works every time, but I think it could be powerful. And we have at other times just had to, like, there's been at least one situation where we had people trying to come in and make our neighborhood something that it should never be, really. And we just had to say, like, we're not going to do this. And because we had built relationships with the city officials, we were able to help build some roadblocks around that activity. So sometimes it is like a more advocacy role of, like, I'm just going to make sure this doesn't happen because I know it's going to be detrimental to the community. So that's a tough one, though, and it's very unique for each context. So
great, thank you, Adam. And again, do feel free to be in touch. I'll drop in my contact information. So if a question's not answered and you have some additional thoughts or follow-ups, please feel free to be in touch. Let's see. So maybe we can come back to kind of an overarching question is resources that are available through the neighboring movement. And I think this will have to be the kind of a wrap-up piece because we're almost out of time.
Yeah, you just want to give the resources where they're at, that kind of thing. Yeah, so the number one spot to go is neighboringmovement.org. That's where you can check out all of the things. If you are in a faith-based setting, we have cohorts that start every January. It's a little bit of a quick turnaround, perhaps, but there's an online cohort which will start at the end of January. You can check that out through the neighboringmovement.org and go to the GNE, or the Good Neighbor Experiment section of that. We are flirting with expanding the animator network, although it's one of the programs that we have often more interest than spots. And so we're going to try to find ways to share that out with more people, but being a part of the cohorts at this point is a little bit harder to do, but we'll try to figure out how to share those resources. One of the ways you can get at least a version of it is there's a self-guided online course that we created, which is available through our shop. It's pretty easily priced as far as getting into it. It's 4 modules that could be done over 4 weeks, going through some of those key ingredients and the practices that we use then with the animators as well. And we have a podcast, we have a blog, we have online social media where we share all these things. And so you can check all those out, or just literally just email us and we'll try to help you. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you so much, Catherine, Elizabeth. It has been such a joy to be with you today. And thank you everyone for coming out, for asking great questions, for being with us. And just, again, stay in touch, join our newsletter list so we can keep you updated on future lunch and learns, or brunch and learns, as somebody referred to it. So yeah, just really deeply grateful to the neighboring movement for being with us, and so glad we got to share with the world kind of the important story that you bring. And with that, we're at time. we'll wrap up. But again, I've got my email in the chat. So if you have any additional follow-up, a burning question we didn't get to, please feel free to be in touch. And of course, you can go to the neighboring movement and find a lot of resources. So thank you, everyone. We'll wrap this up. And thank you again to the neighboring movement.
Thanks so
Thanks
much.
for having us.